Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. As you all know, we have started Genesis here in the adult education curriculum at Crestview. And so, in the last few weeks, we've been looking at the first couple chapters of Genesis. Maybe some classes are a little bit further than others. Uh, but there are many questions that arise about the way in which the world works and the way in which the universe came into existence in Genesis. And these often encourage people to think about scientific questions as well, because scientists are also interested in questions like this. There is what I would call a misconception that faith is somehow antagonistic to science. But we've often seen those two pitted against each other. However, here at Crestview, we have the wonderful opportunity to speak to some of our own because we have a number of scientists that are members here at Crestview, and we've got three of our scientists to come and talk with us today a little bit about themselves as scientists, but also people of faith. I know that you probably know these folks up here, but we're going to give each of our scientists an opportunity to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they do as scientists, but also at first to kind of answer the question, how does faith maybe impact their science, or also their science impact their faith? So we'll start with Dwayne Simmons.
I'm supposed to introduce myself.
Yeah, introduce yourself.
I'm Dwayne Simmons, for those who don't know. And I am a professor at Baylor. Before that, I was a professor at UCLA. And before that, I was a professor at WashU. It goes on and on. So I always tell people I have a hard time holding a job. What I do as a professor is that I do a lot of research at Baylor, and that's actually the reason I was hired to come here, and also to help spur Baylor to the wonderful classification of R1, which has become a research one, so an intensive research institution. And what's cool about that was really good is that it's the only evangelical, or I should say non-Catholic, Christian institution that has an R1 designation. So that's kind of why I'm here in Waco, Texas, is because of Baylor. And one of the things that was really interesting about coming to Baylor was that they were searching for a person to help lead the biology program and to lead it into the next kind of sphere of research. And they wound up choosing me. So what do I do in terms of my research? I do a lot of neuroscience. I study the brain, and I study mechanisms of hearing loss and how those two interact with one another. And so I'm very interested in, for example, how hearing loss. I have a graduate student that some of you know, Evan popped on. He's my newest graduate student, actually. And I am very interested in how cognitive processes are influenced by hearing loss. And as you may know, there's always been an association between hearing loss and maybe Alzheimer's disease or dementia. But we now know that that association is fundamentally a biological association. It is not a social or psychological phenomenon. And so what we're trying to do is look at some of the underpinning causes. One, to hearing loss itself, looking at inflammatory mechanisms. That's the new thing. And that's why I love science, because I get to do new things a lot. And I always said I was going to avoid immunology because I just thought of it as being too complicated. And lo and behold, I'm now doing a lot of immunology. So it's great. And we're looking at then how inflammatory responses can give rise to hearing loss. So that's what I do in my day job. But one of the things that's really cool is that from the earliest time point that I can remember, I've been interested in two things. And that is, one, I just felt the presence of God. I've been very blessed to have that feeling, that belief that God is real and around me, surrounds me. And then number two, I've been just curious about the world. And so those two things to me have just been an integral part of who I am. And they kind of define me. And I've never, ever felt that I was in conflict with myself. And so that was just normal for me to be curious about the world in terms of its physical nature and how things work. And ultimately, that led me to, well, how does this brain thing work? And then also just that presence of God and having that kind of assurance that, that God through Jesus is really key. I wrote a statement back in the 1990s, which is really a long time ago, but I was a young assistant professor at UCLA, and at a public institution, you couldn't really wear your faith directly on your shoulder, not without some criticism. And but I remember I had a lot of people coming into my office, and I would have my Bible on my desk, and the students would say, "So you believe in God?" And I would say, "Of course I do." And they would say, "Wow, and why?" And so I made a statement that basically my belief in God is because of my belief in Jesus Christ. And I also in that statement say that my belief in God in is because when I look at the amazing, amazing creation, from the most basic and fundamental thing to our brains, which are amazing as well, I see God's design in all of that. There's just, in my mind, there is no question the order, the precision, everything that I see just has his fingerprint on it. And so to me, that drives my my curiosity because I want to understand. He's given us the capacity to understand his world. Not only to understand his world, but if you take the Genesis view, to actually be a steward, to take care of that world. And so it's through that capacity to understand and to steward, then we need to, engage it fully. And there have been a lot of times in our history where we have not. But that drives and motivates me. I'm just in awe every time I'm looking in a microscope and looking at how things are working. I'm in awe every time we do experiments with these animals, and I'm totally just pulling out whatever hair I have left. I'm in awe of how it all works and how it is just a fingerprint of God. Does that answer the question?
Very well, yes. All right, we're going to Evan.
Cool. I don't need to say anything, so no. Well, I think that was very well said. I should introduce myself first. I'm Evan Collins. Hi, everyone. I'm a grad student at Baylor. I'm in my 5th year here, so that's how long I've been at Crestview. I'm originally from Arkansas. Please don't hold that against me. But I have I've been married for a little over 2 years. My wife Adria, who is sick and couldn't make it this morning, but you'll usually see us together on a Sunday morning. But yeah, I am in the physics program, so I'm the physics representative. Much less experienced in doing science in general, but yeah. So I guess I won't. Yeah, I think very well said, Dwayne, as far as I agree a lot with the motivations and uh, appreciation for being able to do science and do physics, and specifically said the order in the way that everything physical reality works around us is so ordered. That this is a big something I'm very interested in, and I think is a privilege to get to study it. So what I study is fundamental particle physics, or sometimes we call it high energy particle physics, which is if you've heard of the Large Hadron Collider, is it's a particle accelerator and collider. So we take protons. Maybe I should okay. You know what a proton is? Most of you do, but we learn in school that all the stuff around us is made up of atoms, right? And so those atoms are basically a bunch of protons and usually neutrons clumped together in what we call the nucleus, and then they're surrounded by electrons. These so protons are these positively charged, very tiny particles, and electrons are even smaller. And basically, they, as we kind of say, they orbit in a sense the nucleus, and so it's a complicated picture, kind of. But anyways, my area of research is it turns out that protons themselves are made up of other particles called quarks. Same with neutrons. So, and these quarks are what we call fundamental in that we don't think that you can split them up into something smaller. They're fundamentally completely a quark. That turns out to be the same as an electron. So they are, that's, the electron is the most famous of what we call the fundamental particles. So you can maybe know the periodic table of elements is the stuff that makes up all these atoms, and what I study is the stuff the stuff that makes up all the elements, and then particle physics is what makes up all the atoms. So yeah, I think as a scientist, we went through Romans, in that it talks about that we can know God's invisible attributes. And then I may misspeak a little bit here, but to paraphrase that, we know God's invisible attributes, His eternal power and His divine nature by what has been created. And from the earliest times of people just looking up at the stars and seeing that they go around in the same motions, right? And this was something I think that Plato was one of his reasons for believing in God is just looking at the order of the stars. Why do they go around in the same way, pretty much year by year, or at least you can predict exactly if it's going to change a bit in the sky. You can make predictions and know exactly what they're going to do. And so this is just a testimony to God's handiwork, that He's made the world around us in a way that we can literally write equations and predict how things are, what we can kind of predict the future a little bit in some sense of what things are going to do after some amount of time. And that's basically what physics is kind of all about. What is this stuff that makes up everything around us, and why does it do the things that it does? And so, yeah, my area of research is getting at what is the tiniest things that make up everything around us. And so, yeah, I think just agree with Dwayne, and I'll keep it moving. That it's a privilege to get to study these things because it's a way to know more about God.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Michael Plunk. You probably most know me by my kids. I've got Dawson and Jacob, and then Peyton is the baby. Interestingly, I am between them. I should have been sitting between them, I think, because you have Evan over here talking about what makes up an element, and then you have Dwayne over here talking about the biology. Well, the chemistry is what connects the two of them. If you could look at Dwayne's biology and just go deeper and deeper, you start to see how the molecules themselves are interacting with each other. And that's where my area is. Now, full disclosure, I don't still research very much. I've about 5 years ago finished my degree, so you're almost done. You're almost there. It's a really good feeling to wrap up the dissertation. And at this point, I mostly teach, and I teach organic chemistry, which, if you've heard anything about organic chemistry, that's the scary. All of our pre-med students have to go through it. Well, if they can get through it, because not everyone can, and that is not offensive in any way. It's a very tough subject. So I guess that most of my area of expertise is actually dealing with people now, with students, but I do want to just talk a little bit about what my research was, because it was really interesting. And that's the thing I think we can all agree. Not only do we see God in what we do or did, but it's just cool. It's just cool to see. So I designed molecules, so think like small molecule drugs or therapeutics, with the hope that we could help transplants survive better. And if you know anyone who has had to have a transplant of any kind, you have to suppress the immune system down. Otherwise, there's rejection and things like that. So anyone who's had kidney, heart transplant, this is what happens. My area was actually for diabetes, which I have type 1 diabetes. And the idea is that you can actually transplant the cells that produce the insulin that diabetics don't have, and you can cure someone of type 1 diabetes. Problem is, they die off. And so, how do we get those to survive? Well, with immunosuppressants, you don't want to just knock down someone's immune system entirely, because then what if they get sick? That's a problem. So I designed molecules that could suppress the immune system, but only in the location of the transplant. And it was so much fun. It was a puzzle. I love puzzles, and trying to design the molecule, find out it didn't work. Let's try something else. Find out it didn't work. Try something else, but I can't make it. So now I have to figure out how I'm going to make it. Was a lot of fun. But it did also just teach me so much about our God, because we are all organic beings. We can talk about the drugs, but the drugs only work because they interact with the things that are in our body. And I'm just reminded of in the scriptures talking about how we are fearfully and wonderfully made. We were knit together. And that is absolutely true. And just getting to study those interactions on such a small level, the precision, I think was the word that Dwayne used with how things work, is just, I don't know how you can look at it and say there wasn't a creator that did that. It is just absolutely phenomenal. But I think I'm going to stop there, and let's get into some questions.
All
If I
right.
can just add something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just wanted to let you know that one of the prodrugs that Michael was working on for diabetes, we're now using as a drug potentially to help alleviate or mitigate hearing loss. So there's a lot of interactivity. And so it's just kind of fun it's like, Michael, I'm reading your papers. Of course, it doesn't work neatly and nicely. It's all messy because it's biology, but still, it's just kind of cool.
I was originally a pre-med student, and sorry, Dwayne, the biology is what actually steered me away. I like the chemistry more. Yeah.
So he went to organic chemistry.
I don't know. I enjoyed it. I'm an oddball. I get it.
All right. So I have a few questions, but we want to give you the opportunity in just a little bit to ask some questions. So I'm going to start with some questions. I have 3 questions, one kind of directed at each of the fields of our 3 scientists, and they're going to respond to those questions. But then you will have an opportunity to also ask questions. So the first question is a biology question, and you've actually kind of already touched on it a little bit, Dwayne. Is that there is a zeitgeist amongst many biologists that biology almost disproves God. But you obviously, as a biologist, do not think that. What are things as a biologist, maybe that you can share about more specifically, that might point to the existence of a God?
Okay, first I'll just talk about the zeitgeist, as you called it. Yes, I mean, one of the most amazing kind of overarching theories within biology has been this kind of evolution of evolutionary theory. And so it goes back eons. Even in the Greek times, there were people who thought of things kind of evolving through nature. And then that culminates in the 1800s when we had Laplace and we had a lot of others, and then ultimately, kind of penultimately, culminating with the ideas that Darwin communicated about evolution. And so what was really fascinating and amazing about that is if you adopt a perspective, and I think this is a really important perspective to adopt in the sciences. If I'm going to study the physical world, I need to be able to study that physical world without necessarily proposing that there is a God of fiat who can just intervene at will and do everything capriciously. So I need to create, in essence, a closed system. And so in science, then, this was kind of the beginning of that. I call it a closed system of thinking. And that is that we're going to use naturalistic explanations to explain how things work and how things function, because that is our world right now, right? That is where we operate and live. And so that has been immensely successful in terms of explaining how things work, from biology even to the geological sciences, even to the chemistry and physics. It's been immensely successful. Now, the problem with that, though, is that what is your worldview? Is your worldview such that you are only you're going to limit everything to just the material world and only say that there's only the material world that it exists? Or is there also a non-material world that exists? And there's a lot of philosophical stuff that goes into all of that. But there's a what we call a kind of a scientism, and I would put Richard Dawkins, for example, into that category, where it's like, well, science can really explain everything. That's kind of hard because science only deals with the physical world, but that's okay. He has immediately in my mind a disconnect, but that's okay. Um, and so therefore, since science can explain everything, then there isn't anything that, if science can't explain it or communicate with it, no, it doesn't exist. It's a lot of hubris in my mind, my humble opinion. And then there's also naturalism. I mean, if you adopt the scientism view, basically then everything gets reduced to molecules and basically chemistry and physics. And that's all it is, and it's random events, and there's nothing else. If you adopt a naturalism view, which is the other kind of materialistic view, then everything is just made up of the materials, and there's nothing that, if we can't measure it, because that's what science does, right? If we can't measure it, it doesn't exist. But there's so much more than what we can measure. Can we measure how much I love my wife? Well, she probably says, love me more. But even that's not a measurement, right? That's just, can we measure what your intention is when you're about to do something? Those kinds of things we can't measure. So repeat your question.
I was questioning, what are things that you feel like really points to the existence
So
of God in your
in that
biology?
respect, then there is this amazing, I look at the brain, human brains, as being kind of the penultimate of evolution. And what I see is that evolution brings us to this threshold. It's like God saying, I'm going to create this process. Because remember, in Genesis, there isn't a process. But I'm going to create this process through which fundamentally I'm going to prep everything for interaction with me. And that penultimate interaction is the human brain and mind. And where does the mind come from? Well, we know from a scientific point of view, it emanates from the physical milieu that's up in our skull. And I teach a neurobiology class, and it's just great and it's wonderful. And I tell them all the ways in which it can go wrong. and then they start getting nervous because it's like, oh no, I see tremors. What does that mean? Okay. But the idea, though, is that we have this physical substance, the brain, and somehow out of that emanates the mind. And the mind is such that it can communicate, it can imagine. Imagination is huge. Well, at some point in the genus evolution of hominids, imagination became a thing. Actually, probably not until sapien. So Homo sapien, that's us. And we can show that it's with Homo sapien that we start to get. How do we know about imagination? Look at the cave drawings. Okay? Isn't that awesome? They start to imagine these things. And not only imagination, but how about empathy? How about things like from this physical substrate here, we can control our violence. We have the capability to do that. Not only that, but there are a lot of current neuroscientists who are Christian who think it's not just controlling our violence, our violent behavior, but maybe that was fundamental to our success, distinguishing us from everybody else, meaning all the other biological organisms that are out there. And think about that. Another neuroscience, grounded in neuroscience idea, is cooperativity, that we cooperate. And again, that distinguishes us from a lot of, it's not that you don't see social animals, but we cooperate in a very intentional way to achieve an end. So these are the kinds of things, this brain, that's amazing. We have these qualities that emanate from mind. And that to me are the things that distinguish us in unique ways as being God breathed. And I think God is responsible for those qualities. I can't prove that, of course, but I didn't talk about the other fundamental beliefs. We said scientism, we said naturalism, and then of course there's the Christian and or Judeo-Christian view that God is responsible for everything, right? And so that to me is part of that, where God enabled us to have these kinds of qualities. And why? So that we can love each other and love Him and be stewards of His creation.
Actually,
Yeah,
absolutely. So you mentioned, why a lot of scientists don't believe that hubris aspect of, because we know all this stuff, we don't need God to explain a lot of stuff anymore. I think there's one other area that a lot of scientists who aren't Christians, they just struggle with the view of God. We've already brought up precision and how everything works, but what happens when things don't work
That is, yeah,
very
and
well?
that was Darwin's issue,
Hmm.
because he lost his daughter at the age of 10, and he could never forgive God for taking his daughter away. And that's hard. And my only response to that is, we have a God who loves us so much. He doesn't promise that there isn't going to be disorder and evil, whatever that means, right? But he does say, I'm going to walk with you. And he gave us his son to walk with us in the most amazing way. So he walks with us and wants us to walk with each other, to mourn with each other.
Hmm.
It's just fascinating to me, right?
Mhm.
We can't necessarily say, yeah, I mean, we're not robots, and the world is far from being perfect, and there's a lot of loss, and we experience it every day.
Hmm.
And yet our God says, I'm going to walk alongside you.
When I even think about how we just had Night to Shine, right? If you've ever seen someone who is imperfect, didn't have everything working precisely, we see beauty in that. And I that doesn't make me not believe in God. That makes me believe in God even further, because I feel like I can appreciate His creation more. Um, I actually think it's kind of cool that God has designed us in a way that isn't perfect.
We're not robots.
We're not. We're not.
All right, this is a physics question. So, kind of coming out of the Enlightenment, there was this idea that everything was completely predictable. You could know exactly what was going to happen. You could chart all the things. And then Evans field was discovered. Evan, talk to us a little bit about the kind of how unpredictability works, and thinking especially about, is there such thing as free will?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question for sure. That's still that's pretty. It is hotly debated, I guess, among physicists for sure, of how to interpret this area of physics that's called quantum mechanics, which is not a new theory, really. I mean, relatively speaking, I guess. But at the basically, when we discovered that electrons, the particle I mentioned, were a thing, not too long after that, we discovered that they behave in strange ways, and that they look like waves at time. They behave like waves going through space. So I'm gonna have to be maybe. I don't want to put everyone to sleep who is still awake in the room. No, it looks like most people are still awake. No. Anyways, there's this field that emerged called quantum mechanics that basically says that particles are behave in very strange ways, in that to predict their motion. Okay, so one thing that what we call classical physics, that Newton formulated, um, is that things like a bullet traveling through the air. I'm sure there's many a gun enthusiast in the room. We are in Waco, Texas. But you can shoot, and if anybody's shot like a long range shooting, my dad likes to do that, is that if you know a bullet's speed, basically, and the angle that it's in the air, then you can predict basically exactly where it's going to hit 1,000 yards away or whatnot based off of this angle. And those are, you can look up, usually most people kind of look up a table of how they need to adjust their scope or whatnot. But anyways, you start, basically it's obeying, it's this some law for some reason, law of gravity, basically. And using this law, you can, predict with, pretty good precision of what's going to happen. And so it's kind of deterministic, as we say. You have some initial conditions, the speed of the bullet, you could say, different factors, but primarily the speed and just the angle that it's shot at. You can predict exactly what's going to happen to that. And then quantum mechanics says that, okay, you have some at the most fundamental state of things. If you're dealing with things like electrons, like these fundamental particles, that you have laws that describe them that are non-deterministic. Basically, you have equations that describe where you think this particle is going to be. Not that it's, I guess maybe if you shot it out of a cannon or something, but really you have this law that says, well, most likely it's going to hit here, but there's a non-zero chance of it hitting somewhere else, or maybe even weirder, say if you're hitting a target, there's some okay, maybe a bad example. There's some chance of it maybe passing straight through the target or being going backwards for some reason. There's these, anyways. It has very strange behavior that is non-deterministic, in that it's everything's just based kind of on probabilities. And as if you look at many experiments, turns out these probabilities turn out to hold extremely well as far as predictive power over many experiments. But one thing that but yeah, it's this idea that if we knew every single fact about the universe, where every particle was, that we could predict the future exactly, basically, is the idea of a deterministic view of physics. And quantum mechanics says basically that we can't do that. And so it kind of allows, where people thought, well, because the fundamental laws of physics tell us exactly what happens, then free will itself is just some product of physical things happening in our brains. And one, of course, that even chemistry gets so complicated that our laws of physics are too complicated to work with, say, quantum mechanics, even on for chemistry in a lot of respects, and definitely in biology. It's way too complicated for us to work out our quantum mechanics equations to make predictions. And so it's it's interesting that it kind of provides it's still, I said kind of debated, but it provides kind of some space, at least to understand that that free will can still fit in the picture with physics. Like, physics can't explain many things, even physically, that going on, let alone the non-physical things that we all know to be true, things like beauty, or things like morality, and these things, and of course spiritual things. So obviously we all know, and internally, I guess, that we all have free will. That's something that's obvious. And so usually scientists may want to, well, free will is kind of illusory, but no one acts that way. No one actually believes that is kind of the thing. So anyway, I guess that's what I have to say about that. But I did, coming back to what y'all were kind of talking about before, and with scientists' feelings about, yeah, why it seems like so many scientists are so antagonistic to faith, and it is true. But I guess one thing is I've gone to grad school and gotten deeper into knowing more physicists and knowing some that are doing this science at the highest levels. I've gotten to go to CERN a few times to monitor I mentioned the Large Hadron Collider is Baylor has a very large detector that's underground. So Large Hadron Collider is this 16-mile in circumference ring, called the largest machine in the world, that accelerates these protons, smashes them together to learn what they're made of. And anyways, okay, maybe not shouldn't talk too long. Okay, I'm fine. Anyways, so our there's one detector called the CMS detector, and Baylor has a group that works on it. So I've gotten to spend some time monitoring it as we've been doing these collisions over the last couple of years. And my current research uh, is studying an interaction that hasn't been observed before in these collision events. So a lot of it is just sifting through, a lot of it's programming. It's taking the data, basically a bunch of pictures of these protons coming together, smashing, breaking apart. And we're basically using Einstein's E equals mc squared equation, which is we take energy, which is put into the speed of these protons, smashing them together and creating mass. So energy equals mass, that's what the M is, times the speed of light squared. That's what that c squared is. And so when we say we're creating mass, we can create particles that weren't there when they started. So that's it's a very strange thing that we can do with putting this maybe strange equation that Einstein came up with together. But all this, okay, sidetracked, but I forgot I wanted to give you a little more context to what I do. But getting to know more physicists, and I work on a collaboration of roughly 3,000 people that all work on this CMS experiment, and that's one of 4 on the Large Hadron Collider itself. And so I get to work with a lot of people, which is good. A lot of it is over Zoom with people that are in very different time zones, which means I give very early morning presentations sometimes, like I did last week. But knowing more people, it's most people are the same. And coming back to Romans 1, the context of this verse, that we can come to know God. It's not a happy context in that chapter, right? It's that there are people that don't know God, and so scientists that don't know God, that people that are antagonistic to the faith, are not people to be feared, right? They're people to be loved just like anyone else, because they're in the same boat as everyone else, in that if uh, they don't have God, then they have no hope. And for those of us that do know Christ, um, it's just our call to want them to know Him too. And so we shouldn't have any fear, but it's really it's pity, if anything. But most of all, it's love, that we want all scientists, like all people, to know the love of Christ like we do. And so I think that was just one thing that I was thinking of, that most people are I find people that are antagonistic to faith, that don't really believe in God. It's for the same reasons as non-scientists. It's usually it's because there's some hurt in their life, or they don't really know what the gospel is. And so for as I've come to know fellow graduate students and stuff like this, it's people are hurting in the same ways as other people, for the same reasons, in whatever field it is. It doesn't really matter. So anyway.
Well, moderator change. We do want to leave some time for questions. So, Michael, if you can respond to this last question, 2-3 minutes.
Yeah.
While people generally associate organic chemistry with medicines and the pharmaceutical industry, in what other ways does organic chemistry play a role in our lives?
Yeah, so that's typically what people think of is they think of medicine, and that's a really important.
It was your whole dissertation.
Yeah, there's a really important aspect of organic chemistry, and ultimately that's why I do it. Is it's medicinally applicable and it helps people, right? But I mean, I already said something about us all being organic. All of the things that we're working with are organic. I mean, did y'all drive a car here this morning? That fuel is organic. But I got a couple things I had thought of recently that I just think points towards God, and that is one. I recently was looking up how spiders walk up walls. And all that is they have these microscopic little hairs on their legs, and is what we refer to as London dispersion forces between molecules. So it's an attraction of one molecule to another, and well, the hair to the wall. Um, and I actually use this in my class. I told my students like, "Hey, that's how this works." And then, oh, by the way, a full-grown man is too heavy to do this. So
Don't try it.
sorry, Spider-Man's not real. It doesn't actually do that. I know. But then this one I think was really cool was I run a teaching lab in the spring, and we were going to think about what type of reactions we want to do, what type of materials we want to make. And I came across this one that is turning styrofoam into cinnamon. And I've talked to a couple people about this before because it's cool. But the molecular structure of styrofoam, if you break it down into its itty bitty pieces, is remarkably similar to a molecule called cinnamaldehyde, which is the cinnamon flavor. The difference is a single carbon and oxygen. Now, what makes this a little extra strange is if you know what carbon and oxygen is by itself, like together, that's carbon monoxide, which is also a very toxic gas. So you combine styrofoam with a toxic gas and you make cinnamon. And it's more complicated than that. It does take a little bit more oomph. But, well, you have to heat up the styrofoam really, really hot, and then it turns into a gas that's also flammable. So I decided not to do this in my lab, but I really wanted to because I just think it's so cool.
I'll be watching over I'll be looking over the building.
There's going to be an accident on the news, BSB. But, well, and the reason why it's even looked into is we are supposed to be taking care of our planet. I mean, I hope we all do a good job of not just, generating a bunch of waste. But that'd be a way of breaking down styrofoam into something that could be reused, which is also really cool. But I don't know, just how similar God made each of us in our makeup, and even something like styrofoam and cinnamon are remarkably similar.
I would never have equated
No,
the two.
if I had a whiteboard, I'd draw you the structure, but they're really, really similar.
Well, with that, let's open up to questions from the audience. Questions for anybody on the panel? Yes, over there. So the question is, how do you integrate faith in your teaching, essentially?
I got the mic, so I guess I'll go first. Well, I can't always do it, but I at least try on my first class. Actually, I bring up the story of Exodus when Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, God says, let his people go. And Pharaoh says, well, why should I listen to you? And there are certain things that Moses does, that God does. Moses puts his staff on the ground, it turns into a snake, and Pharaoh's magicians are able to do the same thing. There's a couple things that they're able to also do, but it reaches a certain point where they turn and say, no, we can't do that. That is the finger of God. And without giving you a full history lesson, That used to be what the definition of organic was it was made by God rather than made by man, until man eventually did it and it had to change a little bit. But beyond that, that's at least in the class. Beyond that, I certainly lead prayers at the start of class if a student is going through something, and then I run a weekly Bible study, and it's so cool to be at a Christian university where I can do that. And so we're actually going through John right now. But I wish I had time in my lectures to say more about scripture with my topics, but then we would not get through the material we need to get through, sadly.
I'm just going to do this. I'll speak very briefly in that I don't teach. I have gotten to teach some labs before, but these days I'm a research assistant. So it basically means I'm doing research full time and getting paid very little for it. But but anyways, I do have opportunities with in that I do get to work with a lot of people, and I have people in my cohort that I get to talk to, and it's interesting that physics, especially when you're dealing with what is the fundamental reality of the stuff that makes up everything around us. It's easy to go from questions about physics to questions about metaphysics. Asking things like, why is this stuff here? And so everybody really wants to know what is meaning and the purpose of their life. And so these questions definitely do come up. And I guess maybe just kind of go back to my point is, I've been able to have really nice conversations with, fellow graduate students, mainly of about life, because everyone has struggles, right? And so everyone's basically the same. So as you're talking about life with these people, then you bring up questions of faith and how they deal with struggles and things like morality. Everyone takes offense at something. Everyone thinks that there's right and wrong in the universe. And so I've had some questions, like this one fellow grad student had this issue with someone else and of some behavior that they thought was abhorrent, and it took the opportunity that have a very brief discussion of well, why do you think that's immoral or wrong? Right? Because on a just if everything is naturalistic, if everything is just physics, then there's no real right or wrong, and yet everyone believes that there's real right and wrong. They just may think about things a little differently than other people, and so I've been able to have some nice conversations about that, but. Also definitely my job is do as much research as possible as far as what I'm supposed to be there to do. But anyway.
Yeah, very quickly, great question. When I was chair, I had to ask that question to all my prospective faculty that we were trying to hire, and it was always a loaded question for a lot of scientists, because that's not something that we encounter. People don't normally, and at least at other institutions, it's just not something that is there. But very briefly, because we're over time, I get to do really cool things with my students, especially my undergraduate students, and I share with them, like, when right now I have a project which I call my Hebrew Shema project, in which we're looking at the neuroscience behind the Shema, Hear, O Israel. Hear, auditory system. It's really cool. And what all that means from a neuroscience perspective. And so I get to share with them things like that. And it's just so cool because they eat it up. And then in my classes, invariably I'll go on some tangent just because I'm a professor and I can do this, where, it's like, oh yeah, this reminds me of, and I'll use an example of David, or I'll use an example from the scriptures. And so I can do that freely. I did that at UCLA kind of covertly. But at Baylor, the beauty is that I can just do it, and no one's going to say, "What were you talking about?" or "What were you?" No one's going to be offended. Okay.
Well, I want to thank each of our panelists this morning for sharing your journey with your scientific inquiry and your faith journey at the same time. And it's been fascinating for me just to hear from each of your perspectives, each of your disciplines, how this weaves together. There's a lot of, of course, your own uniquenesses to go with the indeterminacy principle, but also a sort of theme about, in each of your respective disciplines, the beauty of the sort of consistency and perfection of things, but also the openness of things that God is at work and at interplay in. The further you look into reality, God is evidently there at work. So thanks for each of your witnesses and your stories this morning. Thank you guys for combining class today, and I hope this has been helpful. And we will keep doing things like this. Go get your kids, head for worship.
Probably stick with McCormick's, I should say.